Good morning. You've joined the webcast being held by the State Water Resources Control Board, Division of Drinking Water, on the subject of the 1,2,3 trichloropropane MCL. We're now going to move to our introductory speaker. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to the State Water Resources Control Board Division of Drinking Water Training. I'm Kathy Shahan. I'm talking to you from the Division of Drinking Water's Fresno office. I'm going to be moderating today's training session, and today we've assembled a group of experts from DDW to talk to you about the recently adopted 123 TCP MCL and regulation package. The workshop and webcast is intended for managers, operators, and water quality staff of community water systems and non-transient, non-community water systems to which the regulation applies. We are excited to bring you this training to help promote the successful implementation of the 123 TCP MCL and regulation package. Today's presentation will provide training on initial monitoring requirements for 123 TCP, provisions for data substitution, or better known as grandfathering, acceptable analytical methods for 123 TCP, a process for requesting a waiver for initial monitoring, compliance determinations, public notification requirements, DATs for those that have to treat for removal of 123 TCP, and available resources to support the water system with the implementation of the 123 TCP MCL. If you have questions during the presentation, please send them via email to auditorium@calepa.ca.gov. Please note that system-specific questions should be directed to your local district offices or your county environmental health department. We will not be discussing specific water system solutions or proposed treatment systems. In addition, waiver request procedures will be discussed during the workshop, but you are encouraged to work directly with your district office or county environmental health department on any potential waivers. Lastly, all data that you are requesting to be used for satisfying initial monitoring must be submitted electronically via EDT to the Division's Water Quality Inquiry Database. As a reminder, this session is being recorded for those that may want to view it at a later date. The recording, copies of the training materials, and an FAQ will be posted at a later date on the Division's website. Unfortunately, for this particular training, we are not offering CEUs. We will look into that for future DDW workshops. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm pleased to announce that we have 3 presenters today. We have Mark Bartson, Melissa Hall, and Eugene Luong to provide today's training. A little bit of background. Mark Bartson is a professional civil engineer. He obtained a Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering from San Diego State University. Mark started with DDW in May of 1981 in San Bernardino. He's worked in the Sonoma-Mendocino district. Currently, Mark is serving as the DDW Chief of Technical Operations Section, where he oversees senior engineers working on a variety of statewide technical issues related to drinking water, and he also has experience with the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. He's accompanied by Melissa Hall. Melissa is a professional engineer in civil engineering. She earned a Bachelor's of Science and a Master's of Science in Civil Engineering from CSU Sacramento. She has worked for the state and regional water boards for 19 years, and she currently serves as the Senior Water Resource Control Engineer over the Division of Drinking Water's Regulatory Development Unit. We are also pleased to have Eugene Luong. He's a Senior Sanitary Engineer with the Division of Drinking Water's Technical Programs Branch. He's based in our Richmond office. He's been with DDW since June of 1997. He was a sanitary engineer and associate sanitary engineer at the Santa Clara District through March of 2010, and he is also a T4 water treatment operator and a registered civil engineer. In addition to our 3 speakers, we have assembled a panel of subject matter experts to assist with the questions during the Q&A session of the training. I will introduce the expert panel members prior to the commencement of the Q&A session. We are excited to hear what you have for us today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mark, Melissa, and Eugene to kick off the workshop. Thank you, Mark, Melissa, and Eugene.
Well, thank you, Cassie, and thank you all for being here, and those of you who are listening online. The presentation we put together today is designed to be fairly succinct. Can you hear me on the? Okay, so our presentation is fairly succinct, and it is designed to fit well with our letter of December 29th, 2017, which was the utility notification of this new regulation. And for those of you in the room, that letter is here, and I will provide the link to it in just a moment for those of you who are listening online. Before we really get started and start drilling down into any level of detail, we have a few standard kind of disclaimers and helpful advice that kind of always apply. First of all, we ask you to read the regulations and specifically our letter of December 29th on this topic. I know a lot of you won't have time to read the whole regulations, as we have many times over. They are all available on our website, of course. And in particular, if anyone's interested in our response to comments, that's all contained in our final statement of reasons on our regulatory package. So there's a lot of topics that are outside of this presentation that you can find more information on our website. Second thing, if you have questions on your specific situation or water system, contact your district office or local primacy agency. And in particular, in the event of a detection of 123 TCP, it's important and required that you contact your district office or LPA to make sure, it'll help you make sure you have the follow-up monitoring requirements right and have met all of those specific sections. So an outline of our presentation, again, we have fairly succinct here. We have 7 sections. We kind of systematically want to walk through this. And then we have the questions and answers at the end, which I think will really be a good opportunity for everyone to get any questions to our experts here. I am going to go through the background information on 123 TCP, sort of a short summary. I'm going to talk about basic, then I'll turn it over to Melissa for basic requirements and initial monitoring, initial sampling, and the topics that follow. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. I would like to mention a couple other things that the development and adoption of this MCL has been the top priority of our board for some period of time, well over a year. We've been working on it a couple of years. There's a lot of work that went into it. And it's very important to the public, the water industry, and to the communities where this problem may be detected. Fortunately, the vast majority of water system sources, based on previous data, will be non-detect. And we hope that's the case for your water system. We want to make sure you know what the requirements are when there's a detection, how the MCL is determined, and what are the requirements for public notification, consumer confidence report, and so on. So I mentioned this letter of December 29th that we sent out to by email blast to subscribers to our email list. It is available on our website. If those of you online can get it at our 123 TCP webpage, it's the second link under announcements that you'll see here with the red arrow. So that might be helpful if you print it out. So let's talk a little bit about the MCL and how we got to where we are. So the maximum contaminant level for this synthetic organic chemical is 0.000005, which is equal to 5 parts per trillion. For the rest of this presentation, we'll be referring to parts per trillion, so keep that in mind. The public health goal is 0.7 parts per trillion, which was established in 2009 based on carcinogenic effects. And there is no federal MCL for 123 TCP, which is one reason why we needed to adopt a state standard. That's one of the main reasons. So again, there's no federal MCL for 123 TCP. Where else are there any standards? Well, the state of Hawaii has an MCL of 600, which is based on the acute impacts. They did not analyze for carcinogenic risk. And so their MCL is much higher, but it doesn't take into account long-term exposure. Our MCL in the public health goal, in fact, is focused on long-term exposure. 2 other states have health-based guidance values, which are not enforceable, but they use as health-based guidance for making decisions on water systems in their states. So you have Minnesota and New Jersey with health-based standards, but not MCLs. So a little bit about 123 TCP. There's a historical use. When has this been used? Where has it been used? And how much of it has been used? Not a lot of information on quantities, specific locations, but it is known that it's a man-made chlorinated hydrocarbon. Historically, it was used as an industrial solvent, a cleaning and degreasing agent, and a paint remover. And also, most importantly, in many areas of the state, some widely used soil fumigants contain 123 TCP as a minor component, not an active ingredient. And so that is what we do know. As far as detections in groundwater, it's been detected in groundwater for many, many years. It's very persistent in groundwater at low levels. And based on the data up to 2016, about 289 public water system wells statewide had confirmed detections above 5 parts per trillion. And again, a confirmed detection is a sample followed by a resample in this context. Now we do know that although most water sources in the state have been sampled, there are some percentage, somewhere above 20% of community and non-transient community sources that have not yet been sampled, we believe, and so this data is, of course, subject to change. There's a map we have that shows from a bird's eye view of the sources, the location, the area, general areas of the state where these sources are located, these 289 sources. And you might be able to see on the map we have a table that shows at 5 part per trillion we have 289 sources, and at the various other potential MCLs we considered, there's a breakdown of how many wells were detected at the various levels that you might find interesting. So that's basically the beginning of the presentation, the background information on 123 TCP. We're not going to go into any more background at this point. What we'd like to do is get into some of the basic requirements, initial sampling, and waiver requests, and some of the other information that we know is important for complying with this rule. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Hall of my staff. She's the senior engineer of the Regulatory Development Unit, and so she'll guide you through those topics before we move on towards compliance and some other topics. So thank you.
So the next few slides will go over the basic requirements and initial sampling, waiver requests for reduced monitoring, and what to do when 123 TCP is detected. As Mark mentioned earlier, the presentation today is intended to tie in with our water system letter that was transmitted on December 29th. That letter is available at our website on our main page for 123 TCP and under drinking water announcements. In that letter, we direct you to the sources of information on the development of the regulations, the background, the evaluation of economic feasibility, and the results of our peer review. The letter also identifies specific references to the sections of the regulations that are new or have been changed.
Melissa, can I pardon the interruption? We are not seeing the slides. That we're seeing still a slide that says outline of presentation. Oh. I think we lost some connectivity there.
Okay.
It's on slide 13.
Yeah, it advanced to 13 here, but I'll move.
Okay, perfect. I'm seeing slide 13 now. Thank you.
The next few sections of the presentation will cover the changes to the requirements. The new regulations included the addition of an MCL for 123 TCP of 5 parts per trillion and a detection limit for purposes of reporting, or DLR, also set at 5 ppt. 123 TCP was grouped with the synthetic organic chemicals, so even though this is not new, it may have been a while since people have had to deal with synthetic organic chemicals, but this means for community and non-transient, non-community water systems that they'll have to monitor their sources for 123 TCP, comply with the MCL and the water delivered to the public, and report all sampling results within required timeframes. One of the new, we'll summarize the new requirements here and then go into them in more detail over the other slide, during the other slides. The newest requirement is data substitution. There's now an option for synthetic organic chemicals to substitute data collected within the 2 calendar years prior to the effective date of the MCL. Up to 3/4 can be substituted. Granular activated carbon was identified as the best available technology. Water systems that violate the MCL are required to use specific public notification language regarding health effects. And water systems that detect 123 TCP must use specific consumer confidence report language, which was recently updated and is available online. One of the new requirements or new options actually is our organic chemical data substitution. This allows samples collected prior to the regulation's effective date, in this case December 14th of last year, to be substituted for initial monitoring samples. The request must be made in writing to the applicable district. We can only substitute samples in light calendar quarters, so first quarter 2016 could be substituted for first quarter 2018. You can only substitute up to 3 of the 4 quarterly samples. There must be at least 1 new sample during the initial sampling period. And again, it can only be from the last 2 years, so that means 2016 and 2017, and this applies only to groundwater sources. For sample results eligible for data substitution, we have to have them meet the new DLR as well. The only current method that meets the DLR is SRL 524M. For new data, the database provides data validation to only accept this method, but for older data being submitted for consideration of data substitution, we will need to get hard copies of the lab report so we can confirm that the appropriate method was used. For the first year of initial quarterly sampling, water systems must conduct the initial sampling in the quarter beginning in January 2018. Data substitution results from groundwater samples collected during the last 2 years may be eligible for up to 3 of the 4 quarters of initial monitoring. Each individual source must be sampled. Because the DLR and the MCL are the same, composite samples are not allowed. Sources that are designated as standby must be sampled once within the 3-year period that began with the effective date of the MCL. So this year, 2019, and 2020. After the first year, for ongoing monitoring, sources that have not had detects in the first year must be sampled every 3 years, as shown on the slide. 1 sample for systems serving 3,300 or fewer people. 2 quarters of samples for systems serving more than 3,300 people, and those quarters don't have to be consecutive. For sources that have had previous detections or are currently exceeding the MCL, they should contact the district office or a local primacy agency to confirm follow-up monitoring requirements. We realize there's been a lot of interest in waivers and minimizing costs of analysis by pursuing waivers for initial monitoring. Those waiver requests need to be submitted to the local drinking water district office or the local primacy agency. We're going to go over the details of the different types of waivers and what's needed to apply for them. But just to give fair warning, because of what Mark mentioned earlier, that how this chemical has been introduced into the environment, that the fumigants containing 1,2,3-TCP having been widely used for many years, that we don't really know where those areas of use were, that this compound degrades very slowly in groundwater, and that we're looking at a limit in the PPT range. Small quantities can contaminate very large volumes of water. Because of that, the districts and the division are probably going to be pretty sparing with their issuance and approval of waivers. But if after listening to this, if you think you've got a strong candidate or a good case for having a waiver approved, please contact your district office as soon as possible. You're going to need time to put the data together. They're going to need time to review the application. And in case it's not approved, you're still going to need to have time to get out and get those samples collected before the end of March. For use waivers, these are not new regulations, but again, it may have been a while since anybody's needed to look at this. Use waivers, straight out of the regulations, if it can be documented that the chemical has not been previously used, manufactured, transported, stored, or disposed of within the watershed or zone of influence, and therefore that the source can be designated non-vulnerable, may be eligible for a use waiver. The second type of waiver is what we're calling a susceptibility waiver. It's if previous use of the chemical locally is unknown, or they can't demonstrate eligibility for the use waiver, or the chemical is known to have been used previously and the source cannot be designated non-vulnerable, it may still be eligible for a waiver based on a review related to susceptibility to contamination. That application for waiver must include previous monitoring results, user population characteristics, proximity to sources of contamination, surrounding land uses, degree of protection of the water source, environmental persistence and transport of the chemical in water, soil, and air, elevated nitrate levels at the water supply source, and historical system operation and maintenance data, including previous inspection results. In the event of a detection of 123 TCP above the MCL, a water system must contact their district office or LPA within 48 hours. They must conduct follow-up monitoring as specified in the regulations. If a sample result exceeds 10 times the MCL, the water system must contact their district or local primacy agency within 48 hours to discuss potentially removing the well from service. If the water system wants to confirm their sample, if they're surprised that it's high or it's borderline, they may want to do confirmation sampling. They can collect up to 2 additional samples to confirm the initial finding. If one or both of the confirmation samples have 123 TCP detected, then the compliance is based on the average of all of the data, the initial and the confirmation samples. The initial finding can be disregarded if both additional confirmation samples are non-detect. For all systems, if results are more than 10 times the maximum contaminant level, in other words, if they're greater than 50 parts per trillion, the water supplier must notify the state board within 48 hours of the receipt of the results from the laboratory. The contaminated site must be resampled within 48 hours to confirm the result. The water supplier must notify the state board of the resample results within 24 hours. And if the average concentration of the original and confirmation samples exceeds 10 times the MCL, use of the contaminated water source shall be immediately evaluated for discontinuation. A formally discontinued water source shall not be returned to service without written approval from the State Water Board's Division of Drinking Water. And just to summarize the effect of the new regulations, 123 TCP is categorized in analyte group synthetic organic chemicals. The public health goal is 0.7 parts per trillion. The detection limit for purposes of reporting as well as the maximum contaminant level were set at 5 parts per trillion. The best available technology is identified as granular activated carbon. The effective date of the new regulations was December 14th of last year. Initial monitoring start date is the beginning of this year. And public water systems required to conduct initial sampling are community and non-transient non-community water systems. And Eugene Lung will be going over compliance issues and best available technology now.
Thank you, Melissa. So as a reminder, if you have questions, please do send them in to auditorium@calepa.ca.gov, and we can read your questions at the end of this presentation. So we'll be moving on to some examples for compliance with the MCL. So the MCL, because this is a synthetic organic chemical, compliance is based on a running annual average concept. So you look at data that you collected over a 1-year period and collect the average to determine whether your system has exceeded the MCL. However, when you collect 1 or more samples, that's relatively high, and what we mean by relatively high is probably between 5 and 10 times the MCL. Just a single sample itself can trigger the water system to be exceeding the MCL, because no matter what happens after that initial high sample that you can have non-detects, you'll be over the MCL. So the concept for running annual average is generally for you have borderline detection, maybe between 5 and 10, then you can have potentially some samples that's non-detect, so that you have zeros, so you can average it out to still be below or at 5 parts per billion. So
Hi, pardon the interruption. We're still having problems. If you could start to advance the slide a little earlier, I think it's going to be imperative that we're able to see the slides as we go through the remainder of the presentation. Okay. And I understand there's a delay, but that would be great.
Okay, I'm on slide 28. Can you let me know when you see it, please?
I will do that. For those on the line, pardon the interruption, we are experiencing a little bit of a delay in the loading of the slides. So I'm trying to get caught up on the audio so that Eugene can go through our compliance examples while the slides are showing. So just give us a moment and we'll be right back to Eugene. Okay, Eugene, we do see slide 28 now.
Okay, great. So for compliance with the MCL considerations, so number 1, these are the rules that we use. For non-detects are all counted as 0 in determining averages. So if you have any samples as non-detect, you actually substitute as 0 for when you're calculating your averages. And since the MCL is equal to the detection limit for reporting, compliance determination can be very tricky, because the moment you have a detect, you're actually at the MCL already. And if you go above 5.5, then instantly, because you have to round up to 6, then you actually have that individual sample over the MCL. So a value that's less than 5.5 parts per trillion, so 5.0 5.1 through 5.4, all of those will round down to 5. So you're at the MCL, but you're not exceeding the MCL. So as shown on the slide, the following values do not exceed the MCL. Now I have an example on the screen, and hopefully everybody will get to have these types of results, because it's actually, we are showing a water system that with absolutely no detections. So as part of the requirement, water systems are required to collect quarterly samples during the same month, during that quarter. So in this case, the example you're showing, you have February, May, August, and November. All of those are the second month within the compliance quarter. So of all of that, you have the 4 quarters of samples. This is used to meet the initial monitoring requirements of collecting 4 samples. And when you look at the results, all of them are ND. So all of them could be because of detection limit for reporting. So the lab have any detects that's below 5, they'll be reporting as an ND. So be using 0 for the purposes of calculating the compliance. So average of 4 zeros is 0. So in this case, this water system is in good shape. They have completed the initial monitoring requirements. So the only thing they need to do after this is continue to routine monitoring, which will be once every 3 years if it's for for small systems serving less than 3,300 population. Or if it's for a large system, more than 3,300, they need to collect the 2 samples every 3 years, as Melissa has mentioned earlier. Now, in this case, for a small system that's serving less than 3,300, and for systems serving larger, they actually have a different follow-up monitoring requirement. So for smaller water systems, that hopefully is caught up on your screen now, they are required to do quarterly follow-up samples for a year after they have an initial detect. So, and the compliance will be based on the running annual average, or if you have a high sample that will push the water system over the MCL, no matter what you get at the remaining quarters. So there are 2 cases that you need to consider. Do you have a single high sample that will push all the averages up anyway, or do you actually go through the 4 quarters to determine the running annual average? So here's example 2 on the screen that you see for compliance determination. So in this case, again, it's a small water system with some detections. That's what we consider.
This is Carl. I hate to interrupt you, but this is a really important example, and we're a slide behind. And so if you could hold on a second till we get to the actual example.
Okay.
Hey, Carl, this is Kurt. I think the whole thing is delayed, and our phone is faster.
Okay, but just in case, I will wait for you guys to see slide 31 and let me know, and I will go through the sample slowly.
Okay, slide 31 is up.
Great, thank you. So for slide 31, this is for small water systems serving less than 3,300 population with relatively low levels of detection. So in this case, you will see that this system is actually having detects of 123 TCP, but the results is generally very close to the MCL. In this case, looking at a glance, the system is complying with the requirements that they are collecting all the samples on a quarterly basis. So after their first quarter of sample with results of 7.2, they have notified the local office that we have a detection, so we're going to go on with our quarterly monitoring, but it's not over the MCL yet because it's based on the running annual average. So in this case, in May, they collected a second sample is 6.1. So average of these 2 is still over the MCL, but the water system is proceeding because they're not removing the source from service. They're continuing to use the source, and they want to see what type of level do they detect. Do they have seasonal variation? In this case, in August, when they collect the 3rd quarter, it was non-detect. So it could be a detect by a laboratory that's at 4.5. But because it's below the detection limit for reporting, and we set as 5, we'll use a 0 for that particular quarter in calculating the average. And last but not least, for November, they collected the final sample. So the 4th quarter, they have a detect of 7.4. So in this case, when you have the average of those 4 quarters of data available, your average mathematical average is 5.2. But because of the MCL is at 5 parts per trillion and there's only one significant figure, we round it down to the same number of significant figure. So the water system for this particular source is actually at the MCL, but they did not exceed the maximum contaminant level. So the water system in this case is actually in compliance. But so the initial detection, it's completed. They completed the full year of sampling. But in this case, there'll be continuing annual sample, subsequent annual sampling in the quarter with the highest detection. So they'll be keep on tracking the 1, 2, 3 TCP level. The minimum regulatory requirement is that you'll be doing one sample a year. So in this case, looking at all the results, the highest quarter will be the fourth quarter. So subsequent to this, they'll be collecting, assuming all this data is from calendar year 2018. In 2019, they'll be collecting a sample during the fourth quarter because that's the highest level. So I'm in example 3, so everybody can take a look at the slide, and please let me know when the slide's caught up. Then I will go through this example. Okay, thanks, Betsy. So I'm going to move forward so that it doesn't cause additional delay for everybody watching this. So again, we're using a small water system serving less than 3,300. They have their specific set of rules. And in this case, what we call is a relatively high detection. And a relatively high detection is between 5 and 50 parts per billion. So again, the compliance in this case is based on the running annual average concept. And this water system, so in February of this year, this is fictitious, that they collected the first sample and they got a result of 18. And then they decided, like, we don't really think that we have TCP, so I'm going to collect confirmation sample. So they decided to collect the 2 confirmation sample. And the 2 confirmation sample results were 22 and 20 respectively. So with the detection, for the particular quarter, for the compliance determination, they would take an average of the 3 values. So it's be 18, 22, and 20, so the average is 20 for the first quarter. With the detection, the water system is required to move on with continued quarterly monitoring. So they'll be collecting sample in May, and they got the results of 9. And then for the third quarter, they collected in August, it was non-detect, and so it's in November, they also got non-detect. So in this particular case, actually, if you look at the particular results,
We're being asked to just slow.
Sorry. Okay, I will slow down. Okay, so in looking at this slide, so the first quarter average is 20, and then when you have the second quarter results of 9, just calculating the average alone, assuming the third and fourth quarter with non-detect, you already have 7 parts per trillion. So in this case, the water system, no matter what happens in August and November, the system has already exceeded drinking water standard because of the initial relatively high detection of 20 parts per trillion. So in this case, the water system may continue to use it. They enter into continued quarterly monitoring. Maybe sometimes the water quality change that they will actually drift low, that will go into compliance. But generally, in this case, the system is in violation, and they probably will be working with the local LPA or district to determine what type of treatment that they'll be doing. And until the running annual average is equal to MCL or lower, if it does get below and is persistently low, the district office may allow reduced monitoring. Maybe that was just one time that they got detection. But generally speaking, so this is what will happen if you have a relatively high detection at the beginning of monitoring. So now we're going to switch gear for a large water system. So if you're a water system with greater than 3,300 in populations, so compliance actually in this case for SOC, they have very specific requirement when you have detect. If you have a single sample that is over the MCL, you're actually required to collect 6 monthly samples after the initial sample. So as a large system, you're still allowed for after the initial results, you're allowed to do the 2 confirmations. If the 2 confirmation is non-detect, then you can disregard the initial sample. But if you don't do the confirmation sample or it is confirmed, then you're required to collect 6 monthly samples. The MCL is exceeded when the average of this monitoring of all the available numbers is greater than 5.5 because of the rounding. And if the average of this monthly is less than 5.5, the water system is required to continue quarterly monitoring because you have detected it. And determined compliance now will shift from just looking at the initial 6 months of samples to on a running annual average basis. So a relatively high sample, again, can result in MCL exceedance for a whole year, even when the year is not yet complete. So just like the previous examples that I've shown for smaller systems, for large systems, the same thing can happen. So here's an example number 4. So for compliance determination for a larger water system with more than 3,300 population with low detects. So in this case, the water system decided to start sampling next month in February, fictitious data. So in the first quarter, they got a detect of 7. So in this case, because of the detection over the MCL, the water system shifted to the monthly mode. So they are required to collect samples in March, April, May through August for the 6 months. And the results are shown as shown on the screen. So they have 9, 5, non-detect, so on and so forth. And if you calculate the average of all the available data that's shown on the screen, it's actually 5.1. So in this case, again, the systems did not exceed the 123 TCP MCL. It is at the MCL. So the water system is in compliance for this period, but now they're going to shift over to quarterly monitoring and calculate compliance based on a running annual average. Now for example 5, we're going to show another example, a system with an initial result that's relatively high. So in this case, again, a system with more than 3,300 population, they collected the first sample, and the result is 12. So from that onward, they collected a second sample, and because they shift over to monthly sample, they did not confirm. In March, they have a result of 9, and when they collect the third monthly sample, it was 21. At this point, even if you have all the subsequent samples as non-detect, the average is going to be over the MCL of 5. And for this reason, the water systems actually start to violate the MCL beginning in April, because even with all subsequent months of being non-detect. So the average of 7 months in this case is still will be 6 with all of them being non-detect. So in this case, the water system will be able to determine that they have violated the 123 TCP MCL for this source as early as April. So those are the end of the examples. So I'm going to go briefly into treatment technology a little bit. And I know there probably will be questions, and we can come back to these examples during the question portion of the presentation. So for treatment purposes, the best available technology that's been identified for 123 TCP is granular activated carbon, or GAC. So in general, GAC is a very well understood technology. It's already in use for other organics treatment in the valley, and it seems appropriate to be used for 123 TCP treatment as well. 123 TCP GAC has been shown to be effective in reducing the TCP concentration to below the detection limit for reporting. However, the best available technology designation does not preclude alternative technologies capable of removing 123 TCP from being used. But to the best of our knowledge from the Division of Drinking Water, GAC-based or related type of technology is the most effective and have been demonstrated to us to work. If there's an alternative technology out there that you would like to propose, please work with your water system and your local district office. They will get in touch with me, and then we can work together on designing a demonstration protocol to see if an alternative method can be used by the water system. So operations and carbon life. So GAC is a proven technology for organic contaminants, as I've mentioned, but the carbon life can vary depending on carbon type. There are different types of sources to make the granulated activated carbon, and different type of carbon can have very different efficiencies. Some of them can have a much longer life compared to the others. So definitely shop around, and then also actually ask the vendors to do testing for you, maybe side-by-side comparison to see which one for cost benefit of which type of carbon will work best for your source water. There are actually, in part of the regulation adoption package, there's also some information from water systems that have gone through this type of testing. So it's a very good reference of information of how to conduct some of these pilot tests. So water system may pilot test the proposed candidate GAC media to estimate treatment capacity, but at the same time, you may be able to, it's just kind of like we have run the the vendor has run a really good model and they have actually really good track record from what they can present to you. So maybe you want to jump right into installation of treatment because you want to get ahead of the issue. That's possible. So definitely work with your local district office on what type of pilot testing you'll be doing, on how you propose to install your full-scale treatment system. And last but not least, we would recommend to everybody to, at least for now, for permitting purposes, to use NSF NC 61 certified virgin GAC. We are aware that based on the current certification standards, there are some reactivated GAC that was previously used that's been reactivated for use again for drinking water, but we are not comfortable, or we don't have adequate information to see how well the reactivated GAC perform in the long term right now. So our recommendation for the speed of permit review is to use virgin media at that time. And in the future, you can make proposals to the district office or LPA to switch carbon to maybe a reactivated carbon program. And so for overall, looking at treatment and other options that's available for a lot of these water systems, consolidation with a nearby larger water system, that's the number one thing that we would suggest if it's feasible. Because operating GAC media takes a lot of know-how. If the media, you don't have adequate flow through it, you can actually have channeling and it can make the treatment not work so well. So consolidation is definitely a good idea. If you don't want to consolidate, but you're available to connect to a nearby system and be able to become a retailer of the system, so if you can purchase water from a nearby utility, that's also a very good option. Next is to provide treatment. So you need to be working with DDW, with our Division Drinking Water, or with the LPA, in proposing a GAC treatment system for your sources. And then also perhaps drilling a new well. However, because of the very low MCL level and the persistence of the chemical, we're not positive that drilling a new well, you'll be able to find a pocket that you don't have TCP contaminated water that's nearby your water system. And being able to remove the well from use if you have other sources available that can meet your system demand and place this well into perhaps a standby source or something like that, that could be a way for you to achieve compliance as well. So in summary, I think Melissa have shown this slide already. I'm not going to repeat it. So the MCL is 5 parts per billion. It became effective December of last year. Every system needs to start the monitoring by the end of this quarter. So by end of March, you need to have your first sample done. And this regulations is applicable to all community water system and non-transient, non-community water system that have their own sources. So I think that's it for the presentation portion. So Cassie, I'm going to pass this on to you for your introduction of the expert panel, please.
Perfect. Thank you, Eugene. We're apologize for the delay in the audio. I think we got that figured out finally. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we did assemble an expert panel to assist with the Q&A session, and I'm pleased to announce that we have several people that are going to serve on that panel. From the Division's Quality Assurance section, we have Betsy Lichty. She's the Section Chief of the Quality Assurance section. We have Paul Williams. He's the Senior Water Resource Control Engineer over the SIDWIS unit. They're going to handle data-type questions and quality assurance questions. We also have from the Field Operations Branch, Kurt Souza, he's the Central California Branch Chief, and we also have Carl Carlucci, the Central Valley Section Chief. Lastly, we have the Division's toxicologist, Eric Migolino, along with our 3 presenters today. So I'm very pleased to have that panel assembled, and we are equipped and ready to answer all the questions that you might have. As a reminder, you can type them in or send an email to auditorium@calepa.ca.gov. We have someone that will be reading those off and then directing them to our expert panel. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the next segment, which is the Q&A session.
Thank you, Cassie. So we have received a number of emails in our email, but first we wanted to see if there's any members of the audience here with us in the Cal EPA building that have questions. If so, please just raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, we'll go ahead and move on to the online questions. And as I ask the question, I'll try to be directing it to one of our expert panel members, and we may have multiple responses. We are also preparing a frequently asked questions document that we will be posting online that will also include responses to these types of questions for your benefit. One of the first questions I did get was whether the slides would be posted online. We will be posting the PowerPoint presentation, and I will defer to Mark as to whether he would like to post these slides along with the recorded audio.
I believe we will post the slides, yes.
Okay, very good. So moving on to some of the technical questions. What are the health effects of 123 TCP? Mark? Oh, I'm sorry. Eric?
So whenever we talk about health effects, we always go back to the public health goal. That's what's established by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard and Assessment. In the case of 123 TCP, there is risks that are associated with long-term exposure over 70 years. That's what we use as a lifetime, or that's what they use as a lifetime. And risks that are associated with a short period of time. And just the question is specifically asking for those the health effects. So for the long-term exposure, we're looking at types of cancers. For the short-term exposures that we see, what AWIHA used is basically hematological changes, which means changes in your blood, typically reduced red blood cells. And those are what are associated with short-term exposures.
Thank you, Eric. Our next question, how do we prove there has been no aerial spraying in our district or area? And that would have to do with waiver requests, so I'm going to defer that to Carl.
That is a very good question, and because the chemical has been banned for so long, I think one of the slides indicated that is a big unknown. And so for that reason, as was indicated, issuing waivers, particularly use waivers, that would mean no sampling at all because the chemical was not used, probably going to be very rare that we issue a use waiver. It would probably have to be some very, very pristine area up in the mountains. Certainly in the valley, we know it was used all over the place. So that will be something that the water systems will have to try to demonstrate, but I think it's going to be very difficult because unlike some other SOCs like DBCP, where you could go to probably the Ag Commissioner's office and see how much maybe was used when it was legal way in the past, or other chemicals, there may not be a track record of this one. So it's a good question, and that's one reason we're going to be very cautious in issuing waivers, particularly use waivers.
Thank you. Does the State Water Board have any field data that shows that TCP contamination has seasonal variability? Do I have a volunteer to respond to that? Okay. I believe the response to that is we have not evaluated the data specifically related to seasonal variability. Once we have more information from this initial sampling, certainly we'll be able to do some evaluations based on that. Mark?
I would add one thing to that. This is Mark Bartz. And having looked at most of the data, nothing jumped out at us, but Betsy is correct that that would take further evaluations to see if there's some more subtle changes in certain areas. So it would probably be source specific and remains to be determined.
Yes, thank you. Does the State Water Board have any field data that would indicate how localized TCP contamination can be? For example, if there is a water system with 3 wells spaced less than 100 feet apart, is it possible that one well can be contaminated and the other not be? Carl, can you respond to that?
Sure. Well, we don't know for sure because we don't have a ton of data yet, but comparing to other contaminants, particularly DBCP, that we do have a ton of data, it seems it's way more widespread. The only reason a well within a few hundred feet of another well probably wouldn't have it is because of its construction, which is, one method for DBCP. A lot of systems did. They just drilled deeper wells and sealed them much deeper. So you'd have to look at construction. But if they're pulling from similar aquifers and, the depths of the perfs and the annular seal are similar, you're probably going to detect it on a widespread basis. And I think the data that we have sort of shows that.
Thank you. Next question. For a source that has no detectable levels of TCP, you said the repeat sampling is every 3 years. When is a large water system supposed to take the 2 samples within 2 different quarters? Melissa or Mark?
I think that would be best to defer to our district offices. Carl, do you have the answer to that?
Well, this is Kurt. The reg doesn't specify the quarters, but the department gets to specify the year of the 3-year period. So I think we need to work individually with your districts if they want a particular year or months on it.
Okay, then this next question will be for Carl. For surface water, do we need to monitor the raw water and the corresponding finished water, or only the raw water prior to treatment?
Raw water, just like we do other organics.
Thank you. And a follow-up question, Carl. If the source is a blended source and the blend changes from quarter to quarter, is it required to sample the different surface water sources that make up the blend?
That's a good question. You would probably need to talk to the district office directly, but I would think, just like, we don't allow compositing, I think that was mentioned, because the DLR and the MCL are the same, and it's very, very low. We would probably want some sampling of each of the sources. Because of what I heard, if I recall, is the ratio of the blend could vary.
Thank you. And Mark, this next question is for you. Can you confirm that the testing and reporting is only for systems with groundwater supply and not required for surface water systems?
Well, the monitoring applies to all sources for community and non-transient, non-community systems. So I think that was the question.
Yes.
So no, it does apply to surface and groundwater.
So community and non-transient, non-community water systems, all active sources, groundwater and surface water must be monitored.
Yes.
Okay. The next question is also a regulatory question. Mark, do the substituted samples collected previously have to be collected in the same month of each quarter? Is this written in the regulation?
No, it's just the same quarter.
Okay, so we're substituting quarter for quarter. If samples were collected in 2017 quarter 4, but on December 29th, which is the end of the month, does it mean that they will not count for substitution because they were collected after the December 14th effective date?
I think that actually they can count as your first quarter of compliance monitoring, so it will count one way or the other.
So the response is that sample can count, and I would defer that you, in requesting approval for substitution of data, work with your local district office or local primacy agency. Next question. When will we be required to notify the public that we are in non-compliance? Carl, can you respond to that?
Well, we will handle it similar to, all other chemicals, arsenic, DBPs, so on. Once the system or the source has been deemed to be out of compliance, then I believe it's 30 days to provide the public notification. The districts will, at that point in time, or the LPAs issue a compliance order similar to other MCL violations. And so the public notice, will be is required, I believe, within 30 days of determining that a violation has occurred.
Thank you. And this next question is for you, Carl, as well. For water systems that purchase 100% of their water, do they need to sample for 123 TCP?
No. In other words, they do not have any sources. They just buy water from a wholesaler?
Yes.
No. I mean, I guess a situation could be where they're receiving water that has TCP in it for some reason, but the wholesaler would have to deal with it. So, no, it's sources. And if they don't have sources, I can't see a scenario where they would be sampling. Kurt, can you confirm that?
Yeah, I agree. No, the wholesaler would be responsible for the sampling of the water.
Okay, hang on a second. I have lost my...
Let me clarify one thing. I found in a reg that the question came up about commingling of different surface waters. And the reg does say for initial sampling, for surface sources, the samples shall be taken at each water intake. So maybe that helps.
Okay, thank you. And so the next question, Carl, is related to public notification. When would public notification take place following the first quarter result that is, for example, around 100 parts per trillion, hence more than 4 times the MCL?
Well, that would be deemed to be out of compliance, so it would be similar to any other MCL, violation. It'd be within 30 days.
Thank you. Next question, Carl. After completion of the 4 quarterly samples, if they are all non-detect, do I need state regulators' approval for sampling yearly or triennially?
Well, it depends whether the water system is going to apply for some kind of a waiver, but the regulation under repeat monitoring is pretty clear. You would not need our approval because it's very specific that if there are no detects during the initial 4 quarters of monitoring, it's either 1 sample per compliance period for systems with 3,300 or less, or it's the 2 quarters per compliance period for systems with greater than 3,300. And that doesn't typically need our approval because there's no waiver requirement or whatever. That's the normal specified repeat sampling frequency.
Thank you. Next question, Carl. How soon will compliance orders be issued when a source is found to be in violation of the 123 TCP MCL?
That will be dependent upon the district. My guess is in my region, which is a lot of Central California and the Valley, we're going to be impacted quite a bit. We already know. We already have data showing sources out of compliance already with 1 or 2 samples because of the high levels. So it's going to be a district workload like any other workload. But hopefully they will be issued timely, but at least the public notification will be provided. It's probably unlikely that the compliance order will be issued within 30 days, which is required for the public notification, but certainly the districts will provide a copy of the notice that needs to be sent out within the 30-day period. So we'll try to get them out as soon as we can. It just, we don't know yet how many there are going to be, and it's going to be a workload issue.
Thank you. Carl, I believe this next question is for you as well. Is a water system required to turn on a standby well to sample for 123 TCP in the first quarter of 2018? Or can the system initiate sampling when the standby well is first used?
Mark or Melissa, you could correct me. I believe for standby wells, they need to be sampled once within 3 years, the first 3 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's within, I just looked it up, Carl. It's within the first 3 years. So you don't have to turn it on the first quarter. You just need to turn it on and sample it within the first 3 years from January 1st, 2018 for 3 years you have to sample a standby well.
Okay, I'm going to pass this next question on to Paul. The question is, can I still use my results for substitution if they are in the units of parts per billion instead of parts per trillion?
Can you use your data? Yes, I mean, this information should be uploaded to the Division of Drinking Water's database. So that would be information that you would need to provide to the districts in writing along with a hard copy of those results in order to have that information grandfathered or substituted.
Okay, this next question has to do with confirmation samples after detection, so I'll give it to Melissa or Mark. For a large water system, what is the time frame for taking the 2 confirmation samples if they decide to go that route? Do we take them on the same day, week, or month?
I think, this is Eugene. I think generally for confirmation samples, we want them to collect them in consecutive days, not necessarily on the same day, to see if there's variation from day to day for the water quality.
And this is Carl. I'll add to that. The regulation says they have to be collected within 7 days from notification of the initial finding from the lab.
Okay, the next question. Are we only to sample our wells, or do we sample our distribution tanks also?
The requirement is to sample the sources and not, so compliance is based on your sources coming into your system prior to treatment. And if you do provide treatment that can remove TCP, then you need to work with your district office to see if you monitor on the treated water side. But generally speaking, you only monitor at your sources to determine compliance.
And this is Kurt. I think there might be some confusion that TCP is not created by like a disinfection byproduct or something like that. If it's not in your source, you're not going to find it in your distribution system. So this is just source monitoring.
Thank you. Carl or Kurt, perhaps you can respond to this question. For a standby source, if it is not used at all within the 3-year period and does not serve the system within those 3 years, should the system turn on the well, pump it to waste in order to collect a sample?
Yeah, the reg requires you to get a sample within 3 years. So if it's equipped and it's a standby well, it needs to be turned on and pumped to waste and get a sample.
Thank you. Eric, I'm going to put this question to you. Are we aware of any effects, correlation between high nitrate in the source water and the TCP level?
In regards to, is that in regards to health effects?
No, it's just correlation. Or does anybody else have any knowledge about correlation of nitrate and TCP? Carl?
Well, I think where they're going with it is one of the if you want a susceptibility waiver, it says one of the things you have to evaluate is elevated nitrate levels. And I believe what that is intended for is to show the well is vulnerable to surface contaminants. So we know nitrate comes from the top down. It's not naturally occurring, and TCP the same thing. So I believe it's just a way to show that if the well has fairly high nitrates, then it's probably vulnerable to other contaminants, including 1,2,3-TCP.
Okay. Carl, this is a question, I believe, for you related to a large water system. If the first quarter is over the MCL for TCP and the water system is required to take 6 monthly samples, if at that time the average is over the MCL, when will the public notification letter have to go out?
it's at the time that the system is deemed to be in violation. So it could be one sample unless they take confirmations. And again, we already have data showing that some systems that have collected 1 or 2 samples already are out because the levels are so high. So the districts will be working with them on getting the public notification out because they've already been deemed to be in violation.
Thank you.
Unless they take the source offline. Let me be clear. They could take the source offline, and then there is no public notification required.
Thank you. Kurt, could you respond to this question? If the system monitors voluntarily in their treated surface water or treated groundwater, will the results be used towards the running annual average?
No. If you take raw and treated samples, we'll only determine compliance using the raw water samples. Now, if for some reason you're taking both and you are providing, like for instance, if you have a surface water treatment plant that has GAC in it and it's removing some of the TCP, then I think you need to work with your districts on your sampling plan and where we will determine compliance. But, if you just have a simple chlorinator or something like that, it shouldn't matter where you take it. The number should be relatively the same.
Thank you.
I could add one thing to that. Of the 289 sources we mentioned where we have confirmed data as of 2016, none of those were surface waters at that time, so we're hopeful that trend will continue.
Yeah, we don't expect many detects in surface water.
And this is Carl, that's consistent with other SOCs, DBCP, that has been a major contaminant in the valley. I'm not aware of any DBCP in surface water unless there's some pump-ins. I know there's some situations where various surface water sources allow wells to be pumped in, and if they have a contaminant in it, then that would be one way that you would find it.
And Betsy, let me say something else. I was thinking about that first question. If someone has a well now and they've never tested for TCP and it already has a GAC treatment for some other reason, they got TCE in the water or something like that, I would call your district office and maybe sampling raw and treated would be the best way to go. Because if you do get a raw hit, you can prove that you're treating it. So that would be a case where you may want to take both. But please work that out with your staff, with your district, DDW district staff before you do that.
Thank you. Very detailed response. Next question, Carl. When a new well is drilled, what kind of sampling schedule will be needed? If the well is ready to go online of November this year, how do they, my question, I'm guessing they're wondering about whether they'll be able to meet all 4 quarters within this calendar year.
No, they would, obviously you can't sample a well if it's not operational yet. So we are updating our monitoring schedules. Many of the water systems, I think most of the districts do use them. We have a 3-page monitoring schedule that we send out typically when staff do inspections, and we're currently updating them now. And for new sources, it'll simply say you have to conduct initially 4 quarters of sampling. So obviously, if the well's not operational yet, not active yet, you would start whenever it goes online. It would be the first quarter.
Thank you. The next question is related to laboratories. Do we have a list of laboratories performing 1, 2, 3 TCP analyses? And if you recall from the presentation, we are accepting data using only the SRL 524M method because it's able to detect down to the MCL and DLR level of 5 parts per trillion. We are aware of which labs have been accredited for this, and am I seeing head nods? Are we posting this online? Yes, we are. So that will be on our 123 TCP website. Thank you. Next question is related to funding. What about systems who have no money for GAC treatment? Where will funding be available? Carl?
Well, two things. One, I assume, we have a lot of those types of systems in the Central Valley that have arsenic and nitrate and other contamination problems, and it would be handled the same. We have Prop 1 third-party tech assistance providers that can help them apply for funding through our Division of Financial Assistance, and they usually would apply for a planning application. If they're small disadvantaged, most likely they're going to get all grant to do the planning project, and whatever's determined to be the best project, they'll probably get all grant for construction. Now, where the problem comes in is if the first thing we would look for is consolidation. Obviously, we advocate consolidation, and that would be the first thing we would want evaluated in the planning study. If that's not possible, they're in a rural area and no nearby systems, then we probably would look at drilling a test hole to try to get out of it. The last thing we want to do is treatment, because what happens is O&M. Even though we could pay for the capital, the improvements, which in this case would probably be GAC filters, we would want to look at what's the O&M impact to the system. But the system, nevertheless, has to get in compliance at some point. So, that would be what we would do. There is money for, our Division of Financial Assistance. There's money for capital improvements, and if it's a small disadvantaged community, it could be all grant. But the O&M can definitely be tricky. So you really have to work with the district office on funding.
Thank you, Carl. And we would also recommend you look at the State Water Board Division of Financial Assistance website, where you will find their FAST, F-A-A-S-T, site, where you can begin submitting an application at any time if you are aware that your sources already have concentrations that exceed the MCL. The next question, if the water is used for a non-transient, non-community water system and the water is used solely for processing and drinking, can we supply bottled water if the TCP concentrations exceed the MCL, but still use the untreated water for cleaning equipment and washing product? Carl, can you respond to that?
Sure. If I understand it right, it's like a business or a plant, and they use most of the water for processing, wash down, or what have you, but drinking also.
Correct.
Bottled water is not recognized as a permanent solution. It certainly would be a temporary one, but possibly in this case, this would be a nice fit for point of use, because it's an SOC, but you're not really, if you're not showering, you're not worrying about any inhalation really in this hazard, in this risk in this situation. So one possible solution would be POU.
And Carl, to add to your answer, in case there are showers and safety shower, a point of entry may be appropriate so that they can take care of both the inhalation risk and the ingestion risk associated with TCP.
Thank you.
And just to follow up, though, on the use of the water for processing, that you probably would, especially if it's a food processing plant or wash down of any kind of food products, fruits or what have you, probably would need to talk to the California Department of Public Health Food and Drug Branch, who regulate food products, to just make sure that they don't have a problem with using, contaminated water on the food product for wash down or what have you.
Okay, and right now I only have one more question in our inbox, so if you have a question, please send it in. We have reserved this time up until 3 o'clock to make sure that we have responded to all questions that you might have. And while I am responding to the next question, Mark or Melissa, could you cue the slides back to our website to ensure that people know where that website is at and the type of information that's already on it. Okay, so the next question, should we use the 524 low-level TCP analytical method, which has a method reporting level of 0.5 parts per trillion, or should we use the 524 TCP with a method reporting level of 0.005 parts per billion? So in this example, the person is indicating that there is a method that will detect below the 5 part per trillion MCL and DLR. We have not, in working with ELAP, our Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, they've informed us that they have not accredited any laboratories for modified methods that detect below the 5 parts per trillion. Although we are aware that some labs may have developed method modifications, they have not been approved and accredited to run those for compliance monitoring. So when doing analyses for public water systems where the sampling is for compliance with initial monitoring, repeat monitoring, or the routine ongoing monitoring, all analyses must be done with the method that the lab's been accredited for and that has been approved at the 5 part per trillion. So we are specifying right now that we are only using SRL 524M. Other methods have not specifically received ELAP approval for accreditation. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other questions. We might give it another minute. We do have the website up, and within the next day, we will have a recording of this webcast as well as a PowerPoint presentations, and a frequently asked questions may follow within another week or so. And we do have a question from the audience.
Thank you. In the case of a standby well, where it's tested or sampled once every 3 years, what happens after that if they take a positive hit?
Carl, can you respond to that?
Well, that is a good question. I think it would determine on what the level is. If it's, I mean, the purpose of a standby well is you can use a well in emergencies for up to 5 days or consecutive or 15 days in a calendar year. If it exceeds a contaminant that the health risk is based on long-term exposure, like DBCP or TCE or something like that, not nitrates or a bacteriological contaminant, which is an acute, we wouldn't allow a standby well for those. But in this case, it probably depends on what the level is. If it's over 10 times the MCL, you know, a high level of TCP, I'm not sure we would allow it to remain as a standby well. Kurt, maybe you can weigh in on that.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, if you do get a positive, you probably should, you know, contact your district office, and depending on how much you're going to rely on it, possibly do some more sampling. If you do get a non-detect on a standby well, you don't have to sample for 9 years. It's not every 3 years. I believe that's true. Is that true, Carl?
I believe so, but maybe we'll let Mark or
Melissa. But if you do get over 5, that's something you should. Relatively low numbers that are used for standby wells, you know, for short periods of time, are considered acceptable, but higher levels, obviously, we want to watch.
Okay, thank you. We do have another question. I understand that we can get a waiver for the testing requirement for 3 years. We have ND, non-detect results from previous testing. Will we eventually need to do the quarterly testing? What are the ongoing testing requirements after initial monitoring, assuming the ND results are repeated?
So since I presented that portion of the slides, the repeat monitoring, if all your initial samples are non-detect, is if you have a population of less than 3,300 persons, you'll be sampling one sample within the next compliance period that will be designated by the district office, or just once every 3 years. In our plain language, we usually talk about that. And then if your system serves more than 3,300 persons, you're required to do 2 quarters of samples in the next in the next compliance period, or so 2 samples every 3 years, if all the initial samples were non-detect.
Thank you. And one final question, again, is about getting continuing education credits for this webcast. Unfortunately, we set this up very quickly so we could get information out to our public water systems, and we did not have time to set this up in order to provide continuing education credit and, of course, support the documentation for that. Now that we have found this as a forum for providing information to public water systems, as Cassie said earlier, we may be able to do that in the future. I see no other questions that have come in. Cassie, would you like to wrap us up?
Sure, thank you. And first of all, just want to thank our presenters, Mark, Melissa, and Eugene, and also our expert panel members. And then a special thank you to our audience for engaging and participating in the workshop. Your questions are vital to helping us address them for other water systems. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us this afternoon. As a reminder, always contact your district office or your county environmental health department with specific questions that you may have. And unfortunately, a lot of it is case by case, and there's things that we have to work out on individual basis with water systems. So I encourage you to work closely with your district office and your county environmental health department. Also, remember to get your request for data substitution submitted, as well as get geared up for that first quarterly sample, because the March 31st is coming quickly, and there's going to be labs that have a capacity issue just based on the number that are available that have the certification to do the SRL 524M method. So as Betsy mentioned, please look forward to, please look for a recording of today's training, as well as the handouts and the FAQ. They'll be posted on the division's website, and we hope to be able to provide additional trainings in the future. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Cassie?
Go ahead.
Before we end, we did get a couple more questions. So,
yes, well, enough time to ask questions.
Good. So, and these are actually very good questions. First, are specific geographic areas, such as the North Coast, more likely to be granted a waiver than other areas? Carl, can you weigh in on that?
Well, that's a tough one, because I'm here in the Central Valley, and so I can't speak too much to that. We will try to be as uniform as we can throughout the state. I guess if there's some data that's already available and some information showing that it really wasn't used in an area, then yeah, maybe more likely, but I can speak more confidently about my region, and if there's a water system located in the Central Valley, it's probably unlikely it's going to get any kind of waiver, because we know there's been DBCP all over the place, there's nitrates, this chemical's been found, we're sampled, we have systems in the Bakersfield area and Visalia already with JC treating because of it, and a lot of other data. So in the Valley, at least in the Central Valley, it's unlikely. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to get a waiver. But I don't know Northern California. I don't work in that area. We'll try to be as consistent as possible. I don't think, again, on a statewide basis, and Kurt, you could add to this, we're going to be very careful and cautious in giving out any waivers.
And I would say that, to contact your district office, if you're in a pristine area where you've received waivers from SOC monitoring in the past, it would be worth a phone call or an email to your district staff to see if you're eligible for something like this.
Okay, thank you. And the next question, and I'll just go ahead and respond to it. Is there a template for reporting the quarterly results and calculating the running annual average? So I would suggest each water system, if they are interested in such a form, that they contact their district office or local primacy agency We do not have a specific statewide form for such calculations. And we do have one more question. Oh, several coming in. How will sampling be handled for wells that are currently in service but may become non-operational during the year? If we miss a quarter of sampling in 2018 because the well is out of service, can we resume sampling the following year? Carl, can you respond to that?
Yes, if the well, let's say they have to pull the pump or they're doing some rehab on the well and they have 1 quarter of sampling, but then the well's out for a couple more quarters, yes, they would still need to complete the initial sampling. I guess the question would be, would they have to do it in such a manner that they cover all season, all quarters of the year? And I don't believe the regulation says you have to complete 4 initial quarters. Maybe Mark or Melissa could add that. I think you just resume sampling till you get your 4 quarters.
Carl, generally that's the case for water systems that have a well has gone out of service. I think the key is that they don't intentionally take a well out of service, so they don't sample and extend it. So I think the key is for documentation, for them to submit to the district office to indicate that why they can't sample and how they intend to collect the rest of the sample to complete the initial 4 quarters.
Yes, of course what is not allowed is if you take 1 or 2 quarters and the well violates and then the well is shut down and then you start it up again, you don't get to resume, the initial quarterly. You don't get 4 more quarters.
Okay, thank you. And I think the critical point here is that you should be in conversation with your regulatory office so they are aware of the status of the well and of your proposed sampling schedule should the well have to be taken out of service. Otherwise, you will have a violation if the regulator is not aware of your situation. So next question, can multiple sources be blended into a reservoir prior to entering the distribution system to achieve compliance? Eugene.
So we've talked about that. It's really difficult to do that right now because the detection limit for reporting and the MCL is the same. So it really, on a case-by-case basis, you need to be working with your system, like what are the sources, the quantity of water, the reliability of each of the sources. So blending is, in theory, it's possible, but you need to work with your district office on a case-by-case, and we'll be looking at the quality and quantity of each source of water and the reliability of each source of water for you to achieve such a blending scheme.
Thank you. And we have another question about the list of laboratories that are credited for the SRL 524M method and when they will be posted on the website. I'm not sure if the requester simply couldn't find them or if we have not yet posted them, but we will be assured that they are posted at the time that we post this presentation and the slides. Okay, and we do have another question. Oh, thank you. I just want to let the panel know that this information was very helpful. Thank you for all the great information. So thank you, the audience, also for participating. We do simply want to make sure that our public water systems are knowledgeable and aware so you can be in compliance. And again, if you have any questions about your monitoring requirement, contact your district office or local primacy agency. We do have another question. This is an example. We have 11 wells total, but only 4 run year-round. The other 7 are shut down for 8 months of the year. Do we have to activate the wells to perform the sampling in all 4 quarters? Eugene, can you respond to that?
I think in general, in this case, because these are all designated as active source, so per the regulations, they're supposed to sample every quarter to complete the initial monitoring. So that's generally how we would approach it, but I haven't personally dealt with seasonal wells like that. So Carl or Kurt, do you guys have something to add if someone only uses a source seasonally?
Yeah, I would suggest contacting their district staff to see what they've done in the past with this type of monitoring, and that'll be a district level decision.
Thank you. And the next listener has asked us to be more specific about the location of the letter notifying utilities of the adoption of the TCP MCL, and that letter was dated December 29th, 2017. And I do believe that the screen right now is showing the website, and I believe the arrow is pointing to the link for that letter. Is that correct?
Yes, but the URL is not shown there, so it is, you'd have to Google just the right thing. It's through our board page, I believe, so it is a little difficult to find, and we will link that then on our main page.
Go ahead.
I wanted to point this out. It's also on the Division of Drinking Water main page, so it is on the announcements on the main page, so it can be seen there.
Thank you. And we've just updated our homepage for our website, and hopefully it's more navigable for all of our public. Okay, question about the method. What is the analysis the lab should use? So we are requiring the use of method SRL 524M. That was a state-developed method some years ago that was a modification of 524 and is able to achieve reliably to the detection limit of 5 parts per trillion. So that is SRL 524M. And again, we're out of questions, so we will just wait a minute here. Any more questions from the audience? Okay. None. Okay, seeing none, and I think we have truly covered all the bases, both in the presentation and in the questions. Again, if you have any follow-up questions, contact your district office, and they will assist you in any way. So we want to thank you for your participation, and we will be signing off now. Thank you.